Good evening and welcome to our series of sparks or tidbits of the weekly Parsha. This week we're going to be reading the Parsha of Chayei Sarah. The word Chayei Sarah means the life of Sarah. So you would expect to find the Parsha talking about Sarah, her life, things that she accomplished. But if you look at the whole Parsha, what do we read? We read about her death, Thomas Sarah, and Sarah died. We read about her burial. Abraham purchased a plot for her. And then we read about Abraham's remarriage because he didn't have a wife. So the Parsha and all of its details seem to contradict the very notion of this is the life of Sarah. It's a question the Rebbe has asked on several occasions. And the gist of the Rebbe's answer is that, in fact, where do we find that Sarah's life came to fruition? Where do we see her life expressed and manifested? You saw it in her passing, because what is Sarah's contribution? In general, what is the contribution of the matriarchs relative to the patriarchs? And in more general sense, what is the contribution of women, of wives, relative to their husbands? So the Talmud says that a man brings home raw material, and the wife is the one who makes it edible. A man brings raw material, and a wife is the one who makes the material into clothing. Could you just wear raw material? Could you eat raw food? No. It has to be processed. So the feminine spiritual quality is to take the ideals of the patriarchs and to concretize them. And that's what Sarah did. What was Abraham's great ideal? One of his ideals was that he is going to be the father and the progenitor of a Jewish nation. Through whom? Through Yitzchak. But that ideal was not necessarily concretized because there was still a Yishmael, and Yishmael was vying for a equal share of the inheritance. Where do we find that Yishmael was excluded and that Yitzchak would be the only heir? That's in this week's Parsha. Another ideal of Abraham is that he would be the one to possess the land of Israel. Eretz Yisrael is the land in which God's presence is revealed and is the model for the rest of the world, through which we fulfill God's purpose in creation to make the whole world into a holy place. So that starts with the giving of the land to Abraham. Well, did Abraham really possess any part of the land? Not really, until Sarah's passing, when he purchased the cave of Machpelah, and it became his eternal inheritance. So the ideals of Abraham came to fruition and were concretized in the passing of Sarah, and that was what indicated what her life was all about. Now there's a famous medrash commenting on the beginning of this parsha, where it says that Sarah lived to the age of 127. Actually, it doesn't put it that way, 127. It says she lived 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. And Rashi explains that this is to teach us that when she was 100, she was like 20, and 20, she was like 7. Then it says these are the years of the life of Sarah, to teach us, as Rashi says, they were all equally good. So the Medrash says that once Rabbi Akiva was teaching his students, and they dozed off. He tried to awaken them, so he asked them a question that had nothing to do with the lecture, the lesson he was giving. And the question was, why did Esther, Queen Esther, merit to be a queen over 127 provinces? And of course, when they heard the strange intrusion of a subject that had nothing to do with the topic that they were learning, he awakened them, and he said the answer is because she, Esther, was a descendant of Sarah who lived to the age of 127. This is a very puzzling medrash, and the way it's explained, one way of explaining it is that the students of Rabbi Akiva were not sleeping because they were tired, they were sleeping because they were feeling the pain of exile. This had happened shortly after the destruction of the temple, and perhaps shortly after the destruction of Beitar. Major massacres, Torah learning was banned, the Jewish people were at a low. and this is what put them to sleep. They were in a spiritual state of unconsciousness. And Rabbi Akiva tried to awaken them, to show them that even in exile, we could be masters of our fate, we could be masters of our lives. And how do we see this? Esther, the very word Esther means concealment. Even in a time of exile, of concealment, she still was able to be the queen, and that is because she inherited this trait from Sarah, who in spite of the vicissitudes and the horrible changes that occurred in her life, taken by Pharaoh, by Abimelech, not having a child until the age of 90. When she has a child, the child is threatened by Ishmael, and so on and so forth. And yet all of her years were equally good. She was a master of her own life. And that means even in a period of exile, we can be masters. And that's what Esther's power was. And that's what Rabbi Akiva's message was to his students. Where was Sarah buried? Where did she die? So the Torah refers to the place by two names: Chayei Sarah, the city of four, and Hebron, the city of Hebron. Actually, the Medrash says there were four names to this location. Two names that are mentioned here: Chayei Sarah and Hebron, and there were another two that are alluded to in other places. One is called Mamre, and the other was called Eshkol. These are the two names of Abraham's friends, and the area was named after them. And this commentary explains that death occurs because of four reasons. One reason is Mamre. Mamre means rebellious. When a person is rebellious against God, that's a cause of death. The second reason for death is the word Eshkol. Eshkol is used in the Torah to describe when a person suffers a bereavement, a loss of a child, God forbid. That means that the death is caused by someone else. And sometimes the person dies because of a sin that was committed by someone else that caused, unfortunately, collateral damage. It's like gangs are shooting and some innocent people who are passing by get shot. They didn't do anything wrong, but they were extensions of and caught up in someone else's crime. That's the word Eshkol. The third cause for death is Chayei Sarah, the city of four. We are composed of four elements, and when these elements fall apart, that leads to death. That's a natural process of deterioration, of decomposition. And the fourth way is Hebron, which means attachment. When a person is so attached to God that his soul wants to cleave to God, the soul leaves this world and rejoins its earlier connection that it had with God before it was born. Sarah, the cause for her death was not rebelliousness, of course, and not because of someone's sin, but because of the natural process, that's Chayei Sarah, and because of Hebron, her desire to become attached to God. One may take this commentary a step further. The Zohar says that a person who falls from his level is called death. That means when a person loses their interest in a certain spiritual experience, they lose their interest in trying to grow in their Judaism, and they fall to a lower level, that is a form of death. And there are four reasons that can happen. One is because they have a streak of rebelliousness. We all have a streak of rebelliousness in us, and we could use it to be rebellious against the negative influences in our lives. But sometimes the rebelliousness, the stubbornness that we're willing to stand up against everything, instead of using it for our tenacity to Jewish values, we may sometimes allow it to rebel against the things that are holy in our lives, and we fall down to another level, to a lower level. Then it could be, that's Mamre, it could be Eshkol, it could be someone else's influence. Someone else causes collateral damage. We're living together with other people who are not so spiritual, and it causes us to go down. The third reason is Chayei Sarah. It's the decomposition. What that means is that it's a natural process. God created the world that we have ups and downs, we have peaks and valleys, and when we feel low, that's the valley part of our life. We shouldn't get scared that this is something unnatural. It's a natural process. And then there's a fourth reason, Hebron, our attachment to God. We want to get closer to God, and sometimes the only way we can grow higher is by retreating and going backwards a little, by falling a little. As it says, Sheva Yipol Tzaddik. Even a tzaddik has his ups and downs. The reason why a tzaddik has his downs, so we can be able to climb higher. So we have to identify the reason why we're falling. Is it because of our rebelliousness? Is it because of the influence of others? Is it a natural process? Or is it really God's way of telling us, I'm giving you the opportunity to grow even more than you would have if you hadn't had this low? And the truth is that there's probably a little bit of all four in anyone's lowliness. Now, Sarah died because of the Akedah. It's juxtaposed to the story of the binding of Isaac. And the way Rashi and the Midrash explain this is that when Sarah heard that Abraham had taken Yitzchak to be offered as a sacrifice, she didn't even get to hear the part that he wasn't sacrificed, and her soul left her body. We'll take this at a simple level because there were many interpretations of what exactly caused her death. But the simple explanation is that a mother, when she hears that her child might have been taken away from her, could not withstand the pressure, and it caused her soul to leave her body. This explains and answers a very basic question. Why is it that God tells Abraham to take his son Isaac and not Sarah? Sarah didn't even know about it. And the answer is, it was a test to Abraham. God does not give a person a test that he knows they're not capable of withstanding. Abraham was capable of passing that test. Sarah was not, because this is something that a mother cannot possibly endure. And because of that, she never really had this test. When it talks about how Abraham was bringing his wife Sarah to be buried, right after it talks about how he came to eulogize her and to cry over her, it says, Vayakam Avraham, and Avram arose, Me'al Pnei Meso, from, literally translated, from above the face of his dead one. They translate it as he got up from in front of his deceased wife, but it's really the face of his wife. And one of the commentators says something very interesting. The word face in Hebrew was panim. Panim is face, but it also means that which is within. The face in English, when you say face value, it's the most superficial, external thing. But in Hebrew, the word face actually means something that is within, because you could express your emotions through the features of your face. When a person is happy, you can tell the person's happy. When a person is sad, you can tell that a person is sad because you could see it on the person's face, provided the person is alive. When, God forbid, a person passes away, the face doesn't really show any emotion, and therefore you can't really call that person as having a real face, using the Hebrew word. Sarah was different. Even after she passed away, he could still look at her face, if he had chosen to do so, and he would still see her inner life, her inner soul, her spirit, which is another answer to the question why the Parsha is called the life of Sarah when she was dead. The answer is she might have been physically dead, but spiritually, even her body still reflected her inner spirit and her inner life. There's a story told of the Nazis who came into the city of Lezentz, and they walked to the cemetery where the holy Rabbi Melech was buried, and there were Jews standing there and praying, and they realized this was a very special grave, so they ordered the Jews to dig up the corpse. And when they came to the actual body, the Nazis realized that this man, who was not here physically for close to 150 years, that his entire body and his shrouds were intact, and with a smile on his face. And they were so terror-stricken, they ran away, and the Jews were able to rebury the holy tzaddik Rabbi Melech. That when you're talking about great tzaddikim, even when they're not here physically, there's something on their face that you can still see their spirit, their soul is still hovering over their bodies and still expressing who they really are. So Abraham comes to the leader of the Chittim, man by the name of Ephron, and he says, I want to purchase a burial plot, Aras HaMachpelah, And he says, no, I'm giving it to you. Go bury your dead. I'm not charging you anything. And Abraham insists. And then he charges him an exorbitant amount, 400 shekels of silver. And Abraham then purchased the cave of Machpelah. And Rashi says this is an example of someone who says a lot, who promises a lot, extravagantly, and doesn't really come through with it and gives and offers very little. This is in contrast to Abraham, who last week, when his guests come to him and he offers them bread and he serves them a lavish gourmet meal. Abraham said a little and did a lot. In Ethics of the Fathers, Shammai says, Emor miyat, speak little, but v'aseh harbe, do a lot. And this is the hallmark, the difference between a person who is righteous, a person who has integrity, and a person who is not. What is the reason? What's the psychological reason? Why do people promise a lot and do a little? So one reason is because the promise comes from their ego. They're trying to show off their magnanimity. They're trying to show off their generosity and their ability to do so much good. And when it comes to actually doing, why should they do it? They already have the fame and the recognition. As one rabbi poking fun at himself said, I don't have to learn because I already know everything. I don't have to know everything because I'm already famous. Once you feel that you've accomplished the goal of getting notoriety and publicity, you feel that you no longer have the need to do anything. But there's a deeper psychological reason. The reason why we're motivated to do good sometimes is because of guilt. Our godly soul nudges us and pushes us to do something good, and if we don't, we feel guilty. Our conscience bothers us. So what do? We make promises, extravagant promises, and once we make the promises, we don't feel the guilt anymore. And once you don't feel the guilt, there's nothing to push you to do the things that you promised to do. Abraham, on the other hand, did it out of conviction. He did it out of his devotion to God, and therefore he didn't really have to promise a lot. He was very humble in his promises, but he carried out and did much more. When Abraham finally was ready to leave this world, the Torah describes him as Ba Bayamim. He came with his days. He's not just old, but he came with his days. So Chassidus explains, based on earlier sources, that a person can be very old chronologically, but it doesn't mean that he came with every day. If you look at every day of a person's life, and you see what you do in that day, it will determine your true age. You could be 100 years old, but you can be 5 years old. Every day has to be filled with mitzvahs, because in Judaism, time, especially the way Chassidus explains it, time is also a creation. Just like we have to refine ourselves, we have to refine our environment, we have to refine and elevate time as well. Every day has its special significance, and we have to connect to that significance. We have to utilize the energy of each day and make that day holier and holier. And we do that by doing a mitzvah every day. And as the Baal Shem Tov says, that we should make sure to do a mitzvah every day. There are certain mitzvahs that you can do one time, and you can do them all in one day, but you should try to divide them evenly. Obviously, there are certain mitzvahs that you can delay, that every day should be filled with a mitzvah. So you come with each one of those days. Interesting tidbit. Abraham calls in his servant Eliezer, and he says to him, I want you to swear to me that you're going to find me a wife, my son Isaac, because I can't have him marry any of the girls, of the Canaanite girls. I want you to find me a wife from our family, going back to our birthplace. And he makes him swear. It's a very solemn occasion, like he didn't trust him. Now here he's talking to Eliezer. Eliezer is the most trustworthy servant. And the commentary points out that this is the very reverse of society today. If you want to do business with someone and you're entrusting them with a large sum of money, you're going to really have everything written down with lawyers, and you're going to make sure every T is crossed and every I is dotted, because we're dealing with money, and I don't want to take any chances. Even though the person you know is a reliable person, you will want to make sure that everything is guaranteed. But when it comes to matters of Judaism, is the food kosher? Could I rely on this person's spiritual integrity, we trust. We're very trusting. We don't investigate. We don't have to do any research. When it comes to financial matters, we're very careful. When it comes to spiritual matters, we're not. It reminds me of the anecdote they tell of a Jew who was traveling, and he goes into this butcher shop, and it advertises itself as kosher. So he asks the butcher, what do I know? What can I find out about your kashrus and the reliability of your butcher shop? So he takes him to the back room, and he shows him a picture of a venerable old rabbi on the wall. He says, I want you to know, the butcher says, this is my grandfather. He was a very great, holy man. You can trust me then. And the man says, well, if your grandfather was here and your picture was hanging on the wall, I would think differently. But now that your grandfather is hanging on the wall and you're here, I'm not so sure I can rely on it. So when it comes to kashrus, people, they see a picture on the wall, that's good enough for them. When it comes to money, they need to have it written down, and everything has to be done in a way, a foolproof way. Abraham is different. When it came to his finances, he trusted his servant. He entrusted him with everything. He gave him everything he owned to take with him without questioning. He knew he was a man of integrity. But when it came to the matter of principle, a matter of Judaism, a matter of the integrity of the line that's going to come from Abraham and Isaac, here he said, I can't take any chances. Just rely on your honesty and your integrity. I have to have it in writing. I have to give you the oath to make sure that it's not done in a way that will compromise the spirituality of this family. Finally, to make a long story short, this is a long story because the story of Eliezer coming to the place where Rivka lived, and the test that he administered to her. What is the test? That she will not only bring him water upon his request, but she will also offer to bring water to his camels. Why did he use that as a test? Because Abraham is a paragon of virtue, of kindness. That trait had to be part of the matriarchs of the Jewish people. The trait of kindness and hospitality was integral to who would be the fathers and mothers of the Jewish people. And therefore, that would be the test. It wasn't just some random test, but it was one that demonstrated that she was indeed worthy of becoming a wife of Isaac. But the fact that the Torah goes into such great detail about this whole story, Eliezer's trip, and what he said to his and finally, when he comes to Lavan and Besuel, Rivka's father and brother, he repeats the story. The story is repeated over and over again. And Rashi quotes the Talmud that we see here that sometimes God shows more affection to the servants of the patriarchs, to the other teachings of the Torah that were given to the children, the Jewish people, which deal with matters of law, which can only be hinted in a few words. And here we have the story repeated over and over again. That shows us the affection God had for the patriarchs and how fundamental this whole story is. The marriage of Yitzchak and Rivka is not just a marriage. It is the ultimate marriage that brought about the ultimate goal of what the Jewish people were here in this world for. The union of Yitzchak and Rivka in Kabbalah and in Hasidic literature is said to be the union of two dynamic forces, the spiritual forces, which is the ultimate goal of why we're here, to bring these forces together, to bring the spiritual into the physical. Then it says he brought her, Rivka, into his house, and he married her, and then he loved her. First he married her, and then the love came, which is of course contrary to the modern idea of romanticism, that first you have to be madly in love with someone, and then you marry them. Of course you have to love and like the person that you marry, but the love comes later. We see that in society today, that most marriages, unfortunately, do not last, even though they generally, if not almost always, start with love. That shows you that that love is not the cement, the glue that keeps the marriage together. There are other dynamics. The marriage is a spiritual union, and when the marriage is done and acted on in a way that is receptive to God, then the marriage will hold and the love will increase. Because love is not just a physical thing, love is a spiritual thing, and the more spiritual the marriage is, the more dynamic the spiritual energy is, the greater the love. We're told that 3 miracles happened in Rivka's house after he married her. When Sarah was alive, there were 3 miracles. When she died, those miracles disappeared, only to return with Rivka. What were these 3 miracles? And when she lit candles, and by the way, this is the source that even a 3-year-old girl should light Shabbos candles, because Rivka at that time, surprisingly, was only 3 years old, and we'll talk about it some other time, but she lit the Shabbos candles, which predated the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, because we know the patriarchs and the matriarchs did observe the laws of the Torah. They knew about it prophetically, and she lit the Shabbos candles, as did Sarah. And when Sarah lit the Shabbos candles, they lasted until the next Shabbos. She had to extinguish it in order to rekindle it. That was a miracle similar to the miracle of Hanukkah, that the light did not extinguish. That was one miracle. Another miracle, there was a blessing in her dough. That means when she would knead dough, no matter how much dough she needed, even if it was a little, there was always ample supply for the whole week. And the third miracle was there was a cloud that hovered over the entrance of the tent, the cloud being the symbol of God's presence, as we find in the Torah, that in the tabernacle, there was a cloud that hovered over it as a sign that God was present there, and other places where the cloud is the symbol of God's presence. So these 3 miracles that disappeared when Sarah died, even though Abraham was doing all lighting the candles and he had to knead dough or get someone else to do it for him, yet those miracles did not occur, only because of the righteousness of Sarah and Rebekah. And the Rebbe explains that these are the 3 mitzvahs that apply specifically to women, and women have a special role in these 3 mitzvahs. The lighting of the Shabbos candles is literally the same thing as we do today. The dough, the challah, represents the kashrus, the keeping of a kosher home, which is mostly in the hands of the woman. And the third one is the cloud, which is a symbol that the house was a house in which there was no impurity. That symbolizes the laws of mikvah, family purity, that are the province of women, of the mother and the wife, in most specifically, although the man is also involved in fulfilling of these mitzvahs. And where do we find these mitzvahs being highlighted with Sarah and Rebekah? After Abraham married off his son Isaac to Rebekah, Abraham then remarried. He takes a wife, her name is Keturah. And Rashi says, Keturah zu Hagar. This is Hagar. Hagar was his second wife, which he took at the behest of Sarah, because he didn't have any children through Sarah. So Sarah tells Abraham to take another wife, the woman that was a maidservant, and he married Hagar, and she bore him Yishmael. And then, after Yitzchak was born and Yishmael was fooling around, Sarah had him sent away with Hagar, and she disappeared. And now, when it says Abraham went back and he took a wife, and the wife's name was Keturah, according to Rashi, this is not a third wife. Other commentators disagree. But Rashi says, Zu Hagar, this is Hagar. The why she called Keturah, the word Keturah comes from the word Ketoras, incense, that she was as righteous, and she had a pleasant spiritual fragrance just like incense. So the Rebbe once asked, why does Rashi say Zu Hagar, this is Hagar? It should have said he Hagar, she is Hagar. And the Rebbe says that Rashi is here to answer a very basic question. We know that Abraham, probably more than any other person in history, was able to influence other people with his kindness, with his oratory, with his devotion. Thousands upon thousands of people he introduced to monotheism, got them away from idol worship, and changed the world at that time. And in fact, Abraham got his father, who was a professional idol worshiper, and he owned an idol worshipping business. He got him to change, as Rashi says that Terach, Abraham's father, repented. And we know Yishmael, who was not such a righteous person initially, he also came back and he also repented. So the question that one should be able to ask is, how could it be that Abraham couldn't even influence his own wife, Hagar? Hagar was living with Abraham for so many years. How could it be that she left Abraham and she went back to her father's idolatrous ways? Where was Abraham's influence of his own wife? So the question is, where is Hagar? How come she disappeared? She's no longer visible. And Rashi's answer is, Zu, Hagar, this Keturah, this is Hagar. Here she is. She did come back. And in fact, not only did she come back physically, she came back spiritually to express the fact that she was a righteous woman. That is the power that Abraham had and the influence that Abraham had. That will be a shortened class tonight in honor of Thanksgiving. Let everyone go to their turkey, and hope to see you again, God willing, next week.